Hello, and welcome back to part 4 of today's lecture series on reception and ancient art. And in this section, I'm going to be discussing some of the cases in which artists have used Greco-Roman mythological topics to kind of show off and explore their technical abilities both as artists and as innovators, and also to explore some subjects that might be a little bit taboo or uncomfortable for their contemporary societies. So I'm going to start you off today by looking at Botticelli's Birth of Venus from 1482. And here we have, in some cases, pretty recognizable sets of iconographies. Venus herself here is represented in a pretty familiar pose to us, partly shielding her body as she is born and emerges from the sea in one of the myths that exists. If you look at the House of the Marine Venus in Pompeii, you can see a very different composition showing the same mythological scene. And here we have Botticelli using Venus as a showcase for his ability to show the female form, right? He's really highlighted her body at the very center of this enormous composition. It's important to know that this painting is a really huge, sort of overwhelming space that you can kind of fall into as a viewer. The canvas itself is almost 6 feet tall, so you can imagine that she's about life size as a figure. So we have this beautiful female figure. Her skin is almost glowing and alive, dead center in the composition, so your eye goes right to her. He has sort of innovatively decided to use her long, flowing, beautiful blonde locks as like a substitute for the garment or other shielding mechanism that we've seen in the antique versions of Venus. And you see that she's accompanied here by other figures which personify the winds, as well as a nymph who is coming up and bringing Venus an actual cloth garment so that she can wear that. And we have these blowing flowers and the details of the direction of the wind bringing Venus's shell echoed in the wave pattern on the water as well. So Botticelli has really used this myth as a space to really show off his technical abilities, his ability to show the movement of the waves of water, to show the sort of atmospheric perspective receding into the distance, showing the shoreline as it goes off into the distance here with its little peninsulae. As well as to show his appreciation and technical ability, showing off the female form, his ability to show it an ideally beautiful woman with a very sort of angelic face here in this mythological scene. And again, the scale also indicates that this piece is a showpiece. It's a way that the artist can actually show off his ability to the viewers. So another artist working a little bit later is Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and he's my favorite sculptor. And he works in marble, and his mythological scenes tend towards the Roman. So here we have 3 examples. We have Pluto and Proserpina, or Hades and Persephone, if you know the Greek terms. We have Apollo and Daphne, so the story of the god Apollo who chased a nymph, and he was trying to abduct her, and she begged to be turned, to get away from him, and was turned into a tree as her escape, and she becomes the laurel tree here. So we have her transformation into a tree. And then we have a story from the Trojan War, which is the Trojan hero Aeneas escaping Troy with carrying his father Anchises on his back, and with his son following. And I just want to show you a few close-ups of these images. Let's start with Pluto and Proserpina here. So Bernini's sculptures, these marble sculptures are really 3-dimensional works of art. They are designed to be walked around, and they're phenomenal in their level of detail from every side. And as far as technical carving ability goes, these are really masterworks. You see these flyaway pieces, these limbs, the capturing of movement in these figures who really seem to be almost coming to life. The musculature that we talk about all the time that has this sort of anatomical precision to it, but really technical beauty showing up in the way that her hair flies out to the side. And let's look more closely. This is probably the most famous image perspective on this sculpture, you can see the way that the hands of Pluto really appear to sink into Proserpina's flesh, as if these were humans about to come to life out of the marble. So, and you can see again here, this beautiful hair flying up. So extraordinary technical ability used to show this scene of action and high drama. You can see this is well reflected in the face of Proserpina here. And I think I have one more image. Yes, here we have this flesh again. And you have this detail down here that I love of the three-headed dog who guards the gates to hell, the companion of Hades, very excitedly are snapping at Proserpina as she is seized. And I love this picture because in black and white, it really almost just looks like humans posed in the same pose as this sculpture. Another example of his statue is the Apollo and Daphne, as I mentioned before. And this one I think is beautifully notable for the way that Daphne, my favorite thing about it is the way that her fingers turn into leaves, each of which are individually carved into the marble. So they're extremely thin, and you can only imagine how hard it must be to, how much labor intensive it must be to get a stable sculpture out of stone that is almost sort of paper thin. Here you can see some different perspectives as her skin transforms into bark. Again, we have the technical ability of keeping marble stable while also rendering detail that is these flyaway pieces. You know, with our Roman statues and our Greek statues, they're always broken at the nose and the arms and the heads. So here we have these statues that are, nobody made a mistake while carving them that could crack the stone and render it unstable. And then we also have the technical ability of showing the transformation, this moment of metamorphosis partway through. So we have a woman who appears both to be part tree and part human at the same time, rendered in great detail. Here's also the expressiveness of these faces is quite wonderful. So I encourage you to explore at least the Borghese site on that, that museum consortium of virtual museums, because these are where those statues are housed now, and they're very fun to explore. We also see in painting mythological scenes as great inspirations to painters. So here we have several paintings by Peter Paul Rubens, who's famous for his fleshy, very sort of love of the fleshiness and the hardness, softness of musculature, and also very fleshy human bodies, and especially for his sort of love of female forms. So here we have, following on that tradition of our Farnese tired Hercules, we have a drunk Hercules led by a nymph and a satyr. So a place where you can kind of explore topics of low-class activities, right? Like somebody being drunk in the context of a mythological scene, which means that it's not human. So we've seen this kind of tradition since the days of the classical period, where you can kind of displace a topic, a subject in either geography or time in order to arrive at an acceptable arena for playing out scenarios that don't fit into the contemporary culture. Here's another Rubens, and this one shows a scene that you are all familiar with at this point, the Judgment of Paris. So here we have Paris himself, the shepherd, seated on a rock alongside Hermes, and then we have our goddesses who are still noted by their attributes. Here we have Athena with her shield behind her and the Aegis with the head of Medusa on it. So we get a sort of mini painting within a painting. Again, a little bit of a showpiece here, where we have representation within representation. And then we have Aphrodite accompanied by Cupid, her erote here. And then, of course, Hera is represented by this peacock, which is a bird with which she is frequently associated in Roman art as well. Now, Rubens liked this topic so much that he painted it multiple times. So here's another example from 1638, 2 years later. And here we have our women kind of flipped around, right? So we're seeing it from a different perspective, a similar scene. And I'm going to leave it to you in this case to kind of take some time and think about how you identify these characters. And what changes the artist made here? Why do you think he decided to redo this subject? What was it about this myth that appealed to him? And then what were the decisions that were altered from one version to another? And what does that say about the artist himself? I'm just going to talk about one that I think is interesting, which is the prominence of the golden apple itself in this second version. In the first version, I wasn't able to locate it at all. And here we have it sort of central in the composition, being held up by Hermes, the reason for this scene signaling where we are even more clearly than we saw in the first composition. Moving far ahead into the future, I want to show you two paintings by Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was working at the end of the 19th century. And this first is an image of the myth of Pygmalion in Galatea, in which the sculptor falls in love with a statue that he makes of a beautiful woman, and he wishes for her to become real, and then his wish is granted, and she does. So here we see another moment of metamorphosis, a theme that is prominent in both the literature and art of the Roman and Greek worlds, and that gets picked up as something that continues to interest artists who are responding to this period later on. I love about this painting the sort of delicacy with which we see her coming to life. Her feet, as you can see, are just slightly whiter than the rest of her skin, indicating that they remain as marble, as well as the stiffness with which the feet remain posed as her body enters this very living, organic curve, and she moves in to kiss Pygmalion. And then we get this detail, which I think is wonderful, of a little floating erote in the corner, signaling that they're in love and that they are a couple together, but also really drawing on non-classical visions of what an erote looks like. He's coming in on a cloud and he's kind of see-through and glowing, much less literal and more ethereal, more angelic than what we have seen in classical versions with our putti and erotes, who are often engaged in things like making shoes. So in the background, we also have other details that I think are interesting, showing the sculptural workshop of Pygmalion himself. We have theatrical masks, we have a shield, we have seated terracotta figurines and paintings, all of which kind of talk a little bit about the role of the artist, the tools of the artist, picking up on an appreciation for the process of craftsmanship that is showing up in both the iconographic subject matter here, but also as a self-referential way of thinking about the making of art and being an artist on the part of Jean-Léon Gérôme as well. And his interest in those topics is definitely indicated by this next painting, which is called Working in Marble. It's from the same time period roughly, but at least somewhat later, because we have a detail here where on the back wall, the Pygmalion and Galatea painting is actually present in the workshop. And here we see Gérôme himself in a self-portrait, engaged in sculpting a figure called Tanagra after these Tanagra figurines, which are another ancient type of terracotta figurine. And so he is sculpting a version of a Tanagra figurine using a living model here. So another scene in which we see the artist at work in the workshop, even more explicitly self-referential, he and his Pygmalion and Galatea in the background. I think you can kind of work through these interpretative strands on your own and think a little bit about the way that the artist here is using this myth to discuss his own role in the creation of the artistic process as a place where he can kind of play out these ideas and show both his technical expertise and also his involvement in the kind of more mystical aspects of creation that are involved in the artistic process as well. So I want to leave you with this painting. I'm not going to really talk about it except to introduce it briefly as the Landscape with the Fall of Icarus from the 16th century by a Dutch-Flemish painter called Peter Bruegel the Elder. It is one of Bruegel is a really fascinating painter in that he's interested in scenes of daily life, in peasant activities, in large crowds, in landscapes that are sort of all-encompassing and full of lively detail, and these very sort of snapshots in time where you can spend a lot of time inspecting and letting your eye rove around the details and finding new gems. So what I want you to do is kind of think about the following questions. How does the painting represent the myth, which is one that we've encountered before? What parts of the painting most draw your eyes? Why do you think the artist chose to represent the scene in this way? And then if you remember them, how does it compare to those ancient Roman paintings of the myth that we saw earlier in this semester? And how is it sort of a different take on using myth as a way to play around with artistic concepts, showcase technical ability, and reflect on kind of what it means to pick a subject and make art about it. Thank you very much.